I was in the office, buried under a stack of reports that seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant murmur of my coworkers created the usual backdrop of routine. I had just poured myself a lukewarm cup of coffee, the kind that tastes like it's been sitting on the counter for hours, when I heard the familiar ping of an email notification. But it wasn't an email. It was an instant message from my boss, Thomas. "Can you come into the conference room for a moment?" It read. Nothing unusual about that. Thomas often called impromptu meetings, but there was a subtle undertone in the phrasing, something I couldn't quite place. My curiosity piqued. I gathered my notes and walked down the hallway, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and citrus cleaner, a combination that always made the space feel unusually intimate, almost like stepping into someone's carefully curated personal space. Thomas was there, standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline. I noticed how the late morning sunlight caught the silver strands in his hair, and for a fleeting second, I was struck by how different he looked from the high-powered executive persona he usually projected. He turned as I entered, and his smile was warmer than I expected. "Thanks for coming so quickly," he said, gesturing to the chairs around the lawn table. I took a seat, feeling slightly off balance, unsure if this was going to be another routine project discussion or something else entirely. Thomas didn't dive straight into business. Instead, he leaned against the edge of the table, and there was a pause, a silence so deliberate that it felt like the air itself had thickened. I realized I was holding my breath, caught between professional caution and something I couldn't quite name. "I wanted to talk to you," he began, his voice lower than usual, almost confessional. "Not about the reports, not about deadlines. I wanted to check in with you personally. You've been working incredibly hard lately, and I think it's time someone acknowledged that." The words were simple, but they carried a weight I hadn't expected. Most of the time, recognition in a corporate setting feels transactional, fleeting. But there was a sincerity in his gaze that made it feel different, intimate even. I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't for weeks, letting down the invisible armor I wore every day. We spoke then, not about projects, numbers, or charts, but about life, small victories, frustrations, and the quiet moments that often go unnoticed. I felt a rare connection, like someone was truly seeing me, beyond the spreadsheets and conference calls. It was unexpected, grounding, and profoundly human. By the time I left the room, my day had changed. I wasn't sure why or how, but something about that conversation stayed with me. A quiet warmth, a sense that maybe the world was a little less rigid, a little more personal, than I often let myself believe. And that's how an ordinary morning turned into a day that felt like a gentle awakening, setting the stage for a series of moments I would soon never forget. I didn't realize how much that brief conversation in the conference room had lingered until later that afternoon. I was back at my desk, trying to focus on a particularly stubborn spreadsheet, when I caught myself smiling at nothing in particular. It was strange. There had been no fireworks, no dramatic revelation, just a quiet acknowledgement that made me feel seen. And for some reason, it mattered more than I expected. Around mid-afternoon, Thomas's assistant stopped by my desk with a message. "He'd like to see you in the conference room again, if you have a few minutes." My heart skipped a beat, not in panic, but in that anticipatory flutter you get when you sense something meaningful is about to happen. When I entered the room this time, the sunlight had shifted, casting long golden beams across the table. Thomas was already seated, leaning forward with his elbows resting lightly on the polished surface. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything urgent," he said, and I noticed the way his eyes softened, the small inflections in his tone that made the room feel warmer than the fluorescent-lit office outside. "No, of course not," I replied, taking a seat across from him. Something in the air felt different from our earlier talk, a subtle energy that was neither professional tension nor casual friendliness. It was something more personal, something quietly compelling. We started talking again, tentatively at first. But soon the conversation deepened. We shared little details about our mornings, our routines, things we normally wouldn't mention in an office setting. He talked about a small painting he had been working on, and I found myself laughing at the idea of Thomas, the meticulous, sometimes intimidating boss, getting frustrated with a stubborn brushstroke. It was a glimpse into a side of him no one usually saw, and I felt a rush of warmth just being in that space with him. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "You know," he said, "I think most people in this office would be surprised to know how dedicated and perceptive you are." There was no condescension in his words, only honesty, and I realized I was beginning to trust him in a way I hadn't anticipated. The room felt smaller somehow, cozier, the cityscape outside fading into background blur. I noticed details I'd never really paid attention to before: the slight crease in the leather chair where he had shifted, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the citrus cleaner, the way the sunlight highlighted the silver in his hair just enough to make him look almost softer, approachable. It was as though the conference room had transformed from a place of deadlines and hierarchy into a space of quiet discovery. As the conversation continued, I became aware of a strange, comforting tension, an unspoken understanding that this moment, unusual as it was shared and respected. There was no rush, no expectation, just an unfolding of curiosity and human connection. And for someone like me, who had spent years keeping professional walls firmly in place, it was unexpectedly liberating. By the time I finally returned to my desk, the office felt different. The hum of computers and phones seemed softer somehow, less intrusive. I realized that this wasn't just about a simple conversation. It was about recognizing the value in someone else noticing you, in being fully present with another person. And as I sipped my now cold coffee, I felt a quiet anticipation, a sense that what had begun in that conference room might be the start of something deeper, not just a fleeting moment, but a gentle awakening in the rhythm of ordinary days. The next morning, I found myself thinking about Thomas in a way that surprised me. Not in a dramatic, overwhelming sense, but as a quiet presence in my mind. I kept replaying our conversations, the way he had listened so attentively, the gentle warmth in his tone, the way the sunlight seemed to linger on him just a little longer when he leaned against the conference room table. It was odd to feel this drawn to someone I had always thought of purely as my boss, and yet it wasn't complicated or improper. It was human. When I arrived at the office, there was a subtle electricity in the air, a sense that the day might hold something out of the ordinary. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept wandering back to the conference room and the quiet intimacy of those conversations. Mid-morning, I received another message from Thomas. "If you have a few minutes, can you come in? I think today's a good day for a chat." My heart fluttered, not with anxiety, but with anticipation. The conference room felt different that day. The morning light poured in through the blinds in warm golden stripes, and the air had a faint hint of the citrus cleaner mixed with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Thomas was already there, standing by the window, hands loosely clasped in front of him. He turned when I entered, his expression open and inviting. "Thanks for coming," he said softly. "I thought we could continue where we left off yesterday, if that's okay." I nodded, settling into my chair. There was a pause, comfortable yet charged with a subtle awareness of each other's presence. We began talking again, but this time the conversation ventured deeper. We shared not just work frustrations, but stories from our pasts, childhood memories, lessons learned, moments of vulnerability. I realized how rare it was to have this kind of connection with someone who also held professional authority over me. As we spoke, I became acutely aware of his attentiveness, the way his eyes never wavered, the gentle nods, the faint smile that seemed to appear at just the right moments. It was as though he had created a space where I could be entirely myself, without pretense or fear of judgment. And in return, I found myself offering pieces of myself I rarely shared with anyone. There was a moment when we both fell silent, the room filled with the subtle hum of the city outside. I noticed the small details, the way his sleeve brushed the table when he shifted, the faint silver threads in his hair, catching the sunlight, the warmth in his gaze that felt steady and reassuring. It was intimate without being intrusive, personal without crossing any boundaries. "I don't often say this," he said finally, "but I really value our conversations, more than I think I can put into words." The honesty in his voice struck me. I felt a rush of warmth and gratitude, a sense of being seen and understood in a way that went far beyond the workplace. For the first time in a long while, I realized that connection could exist in the most unexpected of places, that emotional closeness didn't have to be dramatic or forceful. It could be quiet, steady, and profoundly meaningful. When I finally left the room that day, I carried a lingering sense of calm and clarity. The ordinary hum of the office didn't feel ordinary anymore. It felt like a backdrop to something subtle but significant, a reminder that human connection, mutual respect, and quiet attentiveness could change the texture of a day, and perhaps even the course of one's life. That afternoon, I felt a mixture of anticipation and calm as I walked toward the conference room for what I sensed would be a defining conversation. The office seemed quieter somehow, as if it too knew that the day had shifted from routine into something more significant. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows in soft, golden rays, dust motes dancing in the beams. It was almost cinematic, the kind of light that makes ordinary moments feel weighty, meaningful. Thomas was already there, seated at the head of the table, looking over some documents. But when he noticed me, his expression softened immediately, the careful professionalism giving way to something warmer. "Come in," he said. "I'm glad you're here." I took a seat across from him, feeling that familiar blend of comfort and nervous energy. There was no awkwardness, no need for pretense, just an unspoken understanding that this moment, like the ones before it, was shared honestly and respectfully. We began talking, but it wasn't about work or deadlines. Instead, it was about life, about choices, about the little things that make days feel full. He asked questions that showed he genuinely wanted to know me, not just my professional side, but my hopes, my fears, the small joys that often go unnoticed. And I answered candidly, feeling a trust between us that surprised me with its ease. At one point, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting mine. "I hope this doesn't feel too forward," he said, "but I value you, not just as an employee, but as a person. And I think it's rare to find someone you can connect with like this, on a level that feels honest and real." I felt my chest tighten, a warmth spreading through me. It was unexpected, yes, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was grounding, a reminder that deep human connection can occur in the most unlikely of places. I realized I had been craving this kind of acknowledgement, this careful attention, for far longer than I had admitted, even to myself. We stayed in that room, talking, sharing, listening, until the light began to shift, long shadows stretching across the polished table. There was a serenity in the atmosphere, a sense that the world outside could pause for just a moment while we existed fully in this space, seen and respected. When it was time to leave, we exchanged a look that carried a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that what had begun here wasn't fleeting, that it had changed something fundamental in both of us. I returned to my desk, but the office felt different now, alive in a subtle, remarkable way. As I sat there, reflecting on the day, I realized something important. Life's most meaningful moments aren't always the ones filled with drama or grand gestures. Sometimes they're quiet, unexpected, and deeply human. A shared smile, a kind word, a conversation that makes you feel fully seen. And in that moment, I felt gratitude, not just for Thomas, but for the realization that genuine connection is possible at any stage of life, if we're willing to notice it, nurture it, and let it in. By the time I left the office that evening, The city lights were beginning to sparkle against the darkening sky. I walked home with a sense of calm and clarity, knowing that the day had changed me, not in a dramatic, world-altering way, but in the way that truly matters. It reminded me that emotional intimacy, mutual respect, and human connection are treasures that can arrive when you least expect them, and that recognizing them is what gives life its quiet, enduring beauty.